Now I should say that there is one more message, but it did not come in video form. There is a lovely essay written for the occasion of this conference, more really of a benediction for the field, which just as soon as we have a moment to sit down with a computer, we will post on the website by none other than Pierre Nara. So you will be able to read that, I hope, by the end of the day today. If you read French, we're working on the translation. It was written for this occasion, and we're very grateful for it. Okay, now we move to the next event, which is the opening actual panel. So if we could have the four panelists come up and join us on the stage. Okay, the purpose of this panel is, as an opening panel of the conference, to talk about the state of the field. Is it a field? Is it a discipline? Is it an ology? What kind of a thing is this that we've done here? What kind of an enterprise are we involved in? And so the idea was to get these four very distinguished leaders of the field to give their reflections on the past, present, and future of memory studies, and then to have a dialogue among us in response to a series of questions that I would pose, and hopefully have time for some questions and discussion with the room. I think we will extend, since we started a little late, we'll go to at least 11:15, yeah? Does that sound reasonable? Okay. Our panelists will speak in alphabetical order. I don't know if there are any poker players in the room, but the chances of having the straight flush of E, F, G, H, is not quite likely. But we'll begin with Astrid Erl. I've asked everyone to speak for about 7 minutes and then begin the discussion.
All right.
Astrid.
You see if I know how to work this? Yes. Hi, everybody, first of all. Now I realize there are really many people here. I have to start with a thank you too. Thanks to Aline, to Jenny, to Jeff for the founding of the MSA, and thanks to Thea, Jessica, Hannah, Rebecca, and many others for organizing this amazing event. So I think that the founding of the MSA is the kind of enormous work that you can and should do just once in your lifetime. If it is true that every man and every woman should build a house, plant a tree, have a baby, then you have not just given us the baby, because I remember the email in June saying that the MSA is born, but you have also built a whole village around it and planted not just one tree, but a rich garden, which, however, will need to be tended by us so that it will grow. I'm sure that in a moment Patrick Hutton or Carol Gluck will tell you how they have come to memory studies. Because I am slightly younger than they are, and because I come from Germany, I can say that I am a memory studies native. I was academically born into an existent field, to stay with my organic metaphors for a while. When I was in the final years of my studies at a German university in the late 1990s, memory studies was already out there. The German was Kulturwissenschaftliche Gedächtnisforschung, untranslatable. It was a highly interdisciplinary field, and I did choose it as one topic of my final exam. So for this exam I read texts by Jan Leider Assmann, by Jörn Rüsen, by Jürgen Straub, and with those four you have already Egyptology, religious studies, linguistics, history, theory of history, psychology, with just those three texts. So if I consider that history, which is my history then the Memory Studies Association took a pretty long time of gestation. And I think it would be interesting to see and to compare how this development compares to that of other fields like gender studies or post-colonial studies. So I think that I had memory studies early on, but what I didn't have was a clear sense of the international dimensions of the field. There were people working on Holocaust memory in the United States, or on the relation of history and memory, so that would be the Hayden White bunch. There was the New School in New York and its interest in collective memory. In Britain, but also in Italy and Australia, there were oral historians who used the term memory. And of course, there was Pierre Nora in France with the Lieu de Mémoire. And at the same time, many transitional societies were reckoning with the past. And sometimes, as in the case of Argentina and South Africa, from that emerged really important conceptual work on memory. But was all this one field? And what was it called? Social memory studies, collective memory studies, cultural memory studies. I really spent years just pondering words. And I think Jeff did so too, probably. So in 2008, Andrew Hoskins gave us a name with his journal, Memory Studies. As simple as that. What a relief. So I think that today we do have a sense, we do have a field self-consciousness across the disciplines and internationally. So you can say, I too belong to memory studies. And one of my favorite games is convincing people that, yes, you too are doing memory studies work. With the MSA, we have a platform. And even if our research is very different and diverse, and that's true, there are things that we can talk about. I would argue that memory studies is the most interdisciplinary field there is. And this is why we have no unifying theories. We have not one methodology, and we have little agreement over a canon. But what we do have is traveling concepts like social frameworks of memory, trauma, those would be some of the traveling concepts of memory studies. And we have an ongoing dialogue on how to approach memory from different disciplinary angles. And that's for me the most important thing. So if you ask me what makes a memory studies scholar a memory studies scholar, yes, it is the interest in how the past is made present. And yes, it is an interest in temporal processes. But at least equally important is the interest in other scholars' work. A memory scholar knows that what he or she is looking at has biological, mental, material, social, cultural dimensions. A range that is impossible to cover by just one person. So, here's a definition. Memory studies is the strong, the emphatic, memory studies in a strong or in an emphatic sense, is the ongoing, the unceasing, the relentless attempt at an ever-increasing multi-perspectivity on the interrelations of the past, the present and the future. And for me, the MSA is the village and the garden in which that multi-perspectival child can be fostered.
Thank you very much. When Jeff told us that we have only 5 to 7 minutes, I said, oh, it's a Southern European, so that amounts to a short sentence. So just excuse me, I'm going to read this initial statement just to make sure I say everything I want to say. I am really grateful to the conference organizers for the opportunity to participate in this roundtable, and also absolutely thrilled about the almost instant coming of age of this association. Honestly, I haven't never seen anything like this in my life. A group of scholars detecting a void and a need, taking the initiative and growing from zero to infinite in no time. Clearly the ground was seeded for this, but you really need the vision, and also an incredible amount of work to make this happen so successfully. So thanks to all of you who are making MSA first imaginable and then possible. Well, to get started, let me tell you a personal story but I will try to connect to the themes that Jeff proposed us to discuss in this roundtable. Going back to my youth. In 1990, I landed in UC Berkeley, ready to start a PhD program in social and cultural anthropology. Overwhelmed as I was in my first trip to the US, barely speaking English, and totally adrift in such a competitive and prestigious academic program, the party had not even started. Before I picked up the first assigned anthropological classic from the library, I learned that the discipline was in deep turmoil, as its connection to colonialism were coming under heavy fire. There was a crisis in the object. Why this interest in the exotic? Just curiosity? Or there were any hidden agendas? There was a crisis in the methods. What were we doing in the field while colonial forces were massacring our research subjects? There was a crisis in representation. Do we have a right to speak for others? In which formats should we approach the encounter with the other? Is it possible to translate cultures? There was also strong critique of the male bias in classic anthropology. Well, to name a few. So, to all these uncertainties, we had to add the lingering shadow of cultural relativism and the ontological insecurity that all anthropologists that are not staunch positivists looking for universal laws of human behavior have on top of our heads all the time. So, well, after a few months there, my dominant feeling was, somebody please get me out of here. Yeah. Well, yet after the initial shock, I learned the important lesson of unlearning, as I realized that all this crisis created the conditions for a most wonderful and creative academic opportunity. Everybody was talking about the need for an experimental moment in anthropology. Some exciting, innovative ethnographies opened up new avenues in academic writing. We became conscious of the need to keep a constant critical eye on our whereabouts, to the extent that honestly, I really don't know of other such self-flagellating disciplines. So we are like masochists, you know. So we were ready to open up to other closed disciplines also, such as sociology, cultural studies, or cultural geography. So the initial discomfort soon turned into enthusiasm about the possibility of refashioning an obsolete discipline. There was a certain sense of academic freedom. Was the field truly reinvented? Well, yes and no. In times, things eventually evened out. Anthropologists went back to the field, continued writing ethnographies, organizing conferences, and falling into methodological and epistemological depressions, which is the mark of the discipline, once in a while. But things were never quite the same. Well, if I tell you this story here, it's because I feel like I'm traveling back in a time capsule, in a time machine, as I have a very similar feeling of excitement and promise regarding memory studies at large. And also about the potential that this association has of becoming a home of academic empowerment for many of us. I see contemporary memory studies as being in a similar innovative moment and as some of the social sciences and humanities were in the 80s and 90s. We have a precious and challenging object in our hands. As an interdisciplinary field still emerging, we have a responsibility to establish honest complicities across fields, to deeply respect the work of those who struggle hard to open and make sense of the field, to create, modulate and refashion common languages and theoretical frameworks, traveling frameworks, of course, to develop powerful interpretative paradigms, to establish academic programs, to build and maintain solid editorial projects and journals. Yet, in my view, and this is my main point here, we should be wary of allowing memory studies from ever transforming into a comfort zone. Let's try to keep it as emergent, unfinished, and creative for as long as we can. As we increasingly understand memory processes, media and agents as unbound, flexible, mobile, and in constant transformation, memory studies as a research field has to be at least as innovative, dynamic, and ever-changing as the objects, platforms, and forms of remembrance we study. In this constant state of creative becoming, I also believe that memory studies needs to stretch out even more from centers to periphery, and Elizabeth Jelin was talking about this now, to incorporate in a more systematic manner non-hegemonic, non-Western scholars and epistemologies of the past. And finally, just to wrap up, although I am sure that not everybody will agree with me, I would also like to see that memory studies develops in a more confident way its double edge as both an academic and a public discipline. Assuming commitments to get dirty in memory controversies in the public sphere is necessary, and multiplying dissemination formats in order to reach out to new and diverse audiences. One only has to look at this year's conference to understand that Memory Studies Association is one perfect location to keep all this energy alive. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really great to be here in the garden and in this dynamic place. It's an amazing conference, an explosion really, I don't know how to think of it, an eruption, a surging, burgeoning thing called memory studies. And we have before us in the next couple of days a memory feast. Judging from the titles of the richest of the papers, and that's all I've seen so far, the titles, the field of memory studies at this point, to use another memory term, is like a palimpsest of the 20th century. With traces, of course, that began in the 19th century, with memory in the nation, but then if you look at the titles of the paper, you'll see war, genocide, dictatorship and the disappeared, traumas. These are all the legacies of a bad 20th century past or pasts, with their consequent focus on victims, injustice, identity, and redress, plus a concern with transgenerational memory of these bad pasts, which is in a way of remembering it forward. And then increasing attention, and this is the later part of the 20th century, to transnational connections and traveling tropes, memory politics and memory policies, transitional justice, and memory in international relations. And then throughout, attention to the media of memory, mass media, museums, memorials, performance, art, films, the internet. So, in a way, the field is already stamped, date-stamped, if you like, 20th century. And now it's the 21st century, has been for a while. And we have a challenge before us, I think, to mention a bit about my own layer in this ever-thickening tablet of memory studies. I'm a historian of modern Japan. I was driven to the subject of memory. It was definitely not my choice. By the never-ending anniversaries of World War II in Asia. The conflicts over memory since the 1980s. Now, in my earlier innocence, I used to think that history and memory were in collusion with one another. But then I was forced to face the fact that they were in collision, and with particularly disturbing political and geopolitical effects. So that's when I set out to study how public memory works, what I call the operations of memory. I did that through studying war memory around the world, and I went global for two reasons, both to make conceptual claims based on a variety of societies, and also in my efforts to keep the world in World War II, to counter the national prison house, if you like, of national memory. And that topic is the subject of my forthcoming work, and that's my scholarly work on memory. But all the while I've been engaged in trying to intervene in public discourse about war memory in East Asia. I don't think I've escaped a war memory debate between the 40th anniversary of the end of the war in 1985 and the 70th anniversary of the end of the war in 2015. The political contention, as most of you know, continues today in regard, for example, to the comfort women, the former sex slaves of the Japanese imperial military, and I'm proud to confess or to proclaim that I am now on the hit list of the Japanese Foreign Ministry for my efforts in this area. I never give a lecture anymore without some consul general standing up to ask a first question with a prepared statement about the comfort women, even when that's not the topic of my lecture. So I have been working, if you like, in the service of what I call connecting good memory to good history, and that is my political mission. And finally, a word about my interdisciplinary experience in a transnational project called the Politics of Memory in Global Context, which combines social scientists and humanists who work on collective memory, neuroscientists and psychologists who work on memory in the brain and the individual, and directors and curators of historical and memorial museums who present the past to the public. This adventure has shown me that interdisciplinary work can be more than parallel play, that if one does it consistently and open-mindedly, it can transform your interpretive landscape. That's my story. And now 3 points that I would like to consider as we talk and listen in the next few days, and then as we think and work on memory in the future. The first point is conceptual, and I know this may sound like a tired old question, but what exactly do we mean by memory? I think we know what we are talking about here in the Memory Studies Association, because we do traverse a common theoretical landscape, even though we take different routes, and we even talk, as Jeff does, about a developed and developing canon of works in the field. But as a historian, I am always asked by non-memory scholars, that is to say, people outside this room, what do I mean by public memory? And how is it different from history? Now I have an answer, but my answer has holes in it. And I'm looking for help in filling those holes, not with a single or singular definition, which is neither possible nor to be wished, but with some greater conceptual perspicacity than I possess. The second point is related, but not quite the same, and it is analytic. We are all, I think, looking for a better analytic of how memory works. For example, we know how memories are created, consolidated, and changed, but we know less about how people, individuals, or groups receive, respond to, and refigure the narratives and tropes that circulate in collective memory. Again, we know about the interrelation between individual and collective memory, but not always in an analytically integrated way. What Andrew Hoskins just said, the relation between memory in the head and memory in the wild. In regard to war memory, I talk about terrains of memory, official, vernacular, individual, and meta-memory. But tracking down the specificities of interaction among these terrains is hard going, particularly between public memory and the personal past. Now, of course, here in neuroscience and psychology can help, but cannot solve the problem alone. And thirdly, in terms of analytics, we know about the changes afforded by and dictated by digital memory, but we know less about the internet as a medium of memory activism and a parallel universe of what you might call alt-memory, like the alt-right. In East Asia, the internet is now a toxic space in which literally hundreds of millions of Chinese, South Korean, and Japanese young people are apprenticing in what I am now calling hate nationalism, speaking not across, but only in their own languages, using memory of the Second World War to learn how to revile and despise one another, out of control of governments or civil society, including in China. Now, this is a new phenomenon that's occurred over the past 15 to 20 years, and I've watched it happen. The consequences when these generations reach their political prime with their youthful hostilities intact are horrifying. Which brings me to my third point, which you won't be surprised to hear, is political. As a public scholar, in Paco's sense, not as a memory activist, but as a public scholar, I am seeking a better and more informed politics of memory, better policies of memory management, better and more responsible uses of the past. I think such past policies and politics are possible, and that there are examples of such realized possibilities that we can learn from. Some speak of a critical memory studies, and that appeals to me. I am in fact studying memory not for its own sake, but to change it. And even if I don't, and even if I can't, that's my goal, the political goal. And there can be no critique without politique. So by the same token, I agree with those who criticize a public memory too dedicated to a retrospective politics, to redressing past wrongs instead of envisioning future rights. To be political and critical means that memory studies has a responsibility as much to the future as to the past. So here's to memory studies, and here's to the future. Thank you.
Astrid gave me a nice lead with mention of essentially generational differences. I'm certainly a digital immigrant, but I guess I like to think of myself as an accidental historian of memory, because my early work, like many of my generation who came of age in the 1960s, we were caught up in the promise of the making of the welfare state. And so many of us at that time studied the political left, revolutionary movements. That was the field in which I first became involved. And I studied the most, we could say, the most radical of the French revolutionary sects of the 19th century, the followers of the legendary Auguste Blanqui. And what I found out, much to my surprise in the course of my research, was the degree to which they relied upon a politics of commemoration, a politics of memory. So that was my introduction to the field, and I would say my historical contribution. From there, I turned increasingly towards topics of historiography. I wrote a book on the art of memory, Modern Uses of the Art of Memory, which is really a study in the history of ideas. More recently, I've turned to problems of historiography directly, the nature of the memory, the memory phenomenon considered as a whole. Do you remember the memory boom? And that's what historians refer to of the first interest in this. And usually the way in which it was discussed was in terms of memory and history. And I think in terms of the understanding of historiographical fashion, there's a sense that you have pioneers, and then you have settlers, and then you have suburbanites. Now when you get to the suburbanites, it's time to move on to a new topic. And I think that may have been the expectation of many historians. But what is interesting is how, I think, quite autonomous strands of study of memory, commemorations, trauma, cultural effects of new technologies of communication, they began to converge. They didn't really amalgamate, but there was a kind of synergy by the turn of the 21st century, so that what we called history and memory morphed into memory studies, and it took off in the way we have seen here. So I prefer the term, as an historian, I prefer the term mnemonic turn to that of memory boom, because it conveys that sense that, well, it's a fashion that's on its way out. In terms of looking at it from the standpoint of a historian, there are three kinds of problems. I'm not going to try to discuss any of these, but I'll sort of pose them, and we may want to deal with some. There's problems of narrative, there's problems of historical time, there's problems of evidence. With problems of a narrative, I'm thinking of efforts to reverse the kind of deconstruction of the grand historical narrative of the sort in which Pierre Nora was engaged. And I'm thinking of the recent book by the French historian Henri Rousseau, The Latest Catastrophe. I see it in a way as an attempt to reconstruct a grand narrative of the 20th century and into the 21st century in terms of catastrophes being our places of memory. Each one kind of jump starts looking at history in a different way. With historical time, I'm thinking of the ongoing tension between presentists and historicists. Presentism, I think, is quite popular among many historians today. There's that study by Francois Hartog about presentism. And I think the sense of it is that the present is your point of departure, and then you work backward genealogically, and you understand something of the diversity of the past. You move it that way. The historicists, I think, hold on much more to that sense that an event is unique in its time and place, the historicity of the event, it happens but once and for all time. And consequently, you have to try to understand events in their historical context, in the past as past. Whereas with presentism, there's that sense of time travel, of importing past into present, and to use it in some ways, I think, responsibly, and I think as some of you have been suggested, in many ways, irresponsibly. And then there's the problem of evidence. The problem of evidence, I'm thinking here of the fortunes of the archive, the material archive, as we enter into a digital age, deeper and deeper into the digital age. And I have to say, I share something of the nostalgia of Arlette Farge for working in the archives, going to the archives and handling the documents, those sorts of things. I think the work of historian Robert Darnton is very important in this respect, that he really gave up his job as historian to become a librarian so that he could have a role in this transition into digital age culture and a way of saving the book. Saving and makes, I think, a very good case for the importance of the material archive of being preserved, maybe nested in some way within our digital age culture. And in things of directions to encourage with all of you, I really like the pluralism of this field. One of the interesting things I see in terms of publication is that so much of the work now is published as anthologies, and I think this is very good because it's a kind of democratization of the opportunity to publish, to participate. Some really fine anthologies out there. Of course, it places a lot of responsibility on editors to be able to draw things together. I think of some of them. Pierre Nora's work, I think, is exemplary in this respect, but so too is the collective memory reader of Jeff Olick and Vered Vinitsky-Sarusi and Daniel Levy, or the work on companionship in memory with Siobhan Gataga. So these are things that I see as really quite wonderful and quite remarkable in terms of the directions that memory studies is taking. It holds great promise, great expectations. Thank you.
Yes. So despite the fact that we're lined up here in a straight table, we had sort of envisioned this as a conversation, and it certainly would have been better if we had had chairs and some kind of discussion round, but hard for people to look down, look while that's going on while we're facing each other. But I hope to generate some discussion. Thank you all for these wonderful comments. So much more than I had hoped for when I sent out a vague list of questions. And you answered all of them in such rich detail, but I hope we can generate some conversation. And so I'd like to start with one issue which all of you alluded to in some of the videos we saw alluded to, but which I think we need to talk about more discursively, is whether we are in a crisis right now, and if that crisis is one of memory or the past? In other words, Michael Rothberg raised this, others raised this. Does memory studies have anything to say, unique, about the commemoration crisis that we have, at least finally? I gave a talk the other day on American exceptionalism. The title was Charlottesville and the End of American Exceptionalism. That something in the United States at least seems to have changed. I think all of us who are based, those of us who are based in the United States, our phones have been ringing off the hooks with reporters wanting quotes and everybody asking, aren't you shocked, aren't you surprised, isn't this a radical turn of events? And my response has been that of course it was shocking, especially since I live in Charlottesville, shocking, but it was not the least bit surprising to those of us who've been toiling in this area for a while. So, are we in a crisis? Is this crisis constituted in some way out of memory? And if so, what do we as a field have to do about this, have to say about this? This might entail simply repeating some of the things you said in a different context, but I wonder if each of you could say something about memory and populism. And is populism the right word? I think that we're right on the borderline in a lot of places between populism, which I find reasonably okay, and fascism, which I don't. So, call me crazy. Where are we today? Patrick alluded to the memory boom. The memory boom was supposed to have gone bust, but it boomed again. Where are we?
I'll start quickly because I'm probably the one who is least involved in political issues, so you can speak longer after that. I like Carol's word. There are responsible and there are irresponsible uses of the past, and groping for a word, is it populism or what is it? If you look about a tendency virtually across the globe, a tendency towards irresponsible uses of the past, and that I think calls for memory studies as also political intervention.
When we're changing messages, and Astrid said something about populism, I said, well, we have to figure out what we mean by populism, because at least in my country, each party is accusing one another of being populist, which is... I wanted to go back in this, connecting this to what Carol was saying about public scholarship, because some of you may know that I started 17 years ago doing research on the process of mass exhumations, mass grave exhumations from the Spanish Civil War, and none of us had the slightest idea about where we were getting into when they got started. It became a huge issue in Spain. So we were literally sucked into the process as scholars, and we couldn't escape it. I mean, it was not even by choice. Then it became choice. No? But for example, I remember situations like, just imagine you organize something like this and you have a very attentive audience, and then we discuss about our scholarship topics, and then suddenly there is a respectful silence, and when we finished talking, there is a hand raised, and somebody said, I want to speak about my father, because he was killed. So the thing is that, at least in the case of Spain, they hadn't been able to speak up in public spaces for 70 years. And then you have institutional setting, you have logos, you have Spanish National Research Council, whatever. So everybody was coming to the conferences to talk about their story. So that, for me, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, so I use the conferences as fieldwork. It's a new avenue for fieldwork. So suddenly we got into the whole thing, and then you have to take very difficult choices because suddenly you kind of become the representative for certain associations, and you may not like their politics, and I'm sure you've gotten into these issues. And then the associations kind of construct pools of scholars that are akin to their thinking about memory, you know? And then you get calls. I mean, I would get to my office, and as you were saying, the telephone would be ringing off the hook all the time through the morning. And so I had to learn new skills, like how to construct a headline, how to utter a soundbite, how to be meaningful in very concrete ways, how to popularize, or how to talk about your reflections, which can be very abstract in ways in which it could be understood by a general public. And I think this is something absolutely crucial for our disciplines. And what we have done is like we have done a lot of outreach work, because we think that the only way we can fight populism is making the debate more complex and trying to break the "you more" kind of, you killed us more than we did, kind of logic that lies behind these populist movements. And so our whole effort has been just to break up. And we felt a social responsibility to go out and do it, literally. You know? And I'm also now under the radar of the extreme right, so in Spain, and they don't like me very much, no? But one of them, he told me, "I respect you," which I'm very happy to do. Probably that is on here alive. But I mean, just a few thoughts about what we can do in situations in which it's. I mean, it doesn't mean that all memory scholarship has to be about public memory or critical scholarship, but there are many, and I do think we are in a general crisis in the world, and it's not going to stop soon. So I think we should engage.
I think we're in crisis too. But I think it's a crisis that, let me say this, that very often in times of crisis, the past is remobilized. So it's not unusual when you have a political, a socioeconomic crisis that the past becomes irresponsibly often mobilized for whatever the purposes of the present are. So in that regard, this is not new. In terms of the crisis now that is sometimes called populism, in a lot of the countries that I study, the word really doesn't apply. It's really nationalism. I mean, it's nationalism in Japan, it's nationalism in China, it's nationalism in India, and I think you would agree that it's nationalism in Russia. They're all doing the same thing as the populists. They are all mobilizing the past for their purposes. And they're all rewriting the past. I mean, these are governments in many of these countries which have they have everything but a ministry of history. In other words, they have taken the rewriting of the past into the government in their efforts. So the memory is part of the crisis, but it's not about the statues. It's not about the things that people are talking about. It's about what's causing them to look at their past this way. So for me, the important thing is, number one, to try to understand what's behind the crisis. The memory manipulations are a response to it. And the it is as important to us as scholars of memory as the way memory is being manipulated. That's number one. Number two, I do think that, with Paco, that we have something to bring to the table, because I actually think that despite, particularly in the countries I know, despite the official manipulations of memory, they are not always successful, obviously, because in all these societies there are a range of memories of the past. And so it's not as if this is these are not societies that have bought into the new single view. This is true in China as well as in Russia. Haven't bought into the single view the government's putting out now. So we have a responsibility to, well, we have to be careful with the word complicate, because everybody in the real world says that all scholars want to do is say it's more complicated than that. We can't take refuge in complexity. And that's why the sound bites are important. We do have to find ways of expressing this more complex past in an understandable, comprehensible, communicable way to the public. And that's what I think Paco was referring to. And when we do that, and this is my third point, it's very important for us not to become, what you suggested, pet historians for a particular point of view. So that if you become a partisan for a particular association, for those of the victims of the Francoists, or for those of the survivors of or the relations of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, you're losing an opportunity for the kind of moderate, how can I put this, a moderate expression of whatever it is you're concerned about in such a way that doesn't render you useless because you are tagged as a member of this protest or that position. And specifically in my case, I am in my public pronouncements a lot more moderate about the present government of Japan than I feel as a political person. And why am I moderate? Because I want to reach them. And there's no sense in my taking the opposition position without trying to understand why it is that the government of Japan is taking the particular memory politics that it is. So there's a responsibility for, if you like, a kind of scholarly nonpartisanship to try to intrude or intervene in memory politics in a scholarly way. And I think that third point is very important. It's fine to be oppositional and have your own protests and your own politics, but in these interventions, I think our responsibility lies on the academic side. And that's not an easy tightrope to walk, but I think we can do it. And that's our role, these memory scholars in this room, that's our role in the crisis. Those three things. One, it's not about memory, it's about something else. Two, we really have to understand how to communicate. And three, we have to take positions that are not so positioned as to be easily dismissed by those very people we are targeting.
I want to speak directly to the issue of populism. Populism has been with us for a long, long time. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on populism within the movement following General Boulanger in the late 19th century. And the demagoguery and much of the rhetoric was the same. But what was distinctive about that movement, in its rudimentary beginnings, was the capacity to use publicity effectively. And that has only increased. So I think the crisis we're in has to do with this long revolution in the invention and innovation in technologies of communication. Because every populist right-wing movement through the 20th century and into our own times has used that kind of publicity very effectively. And so that today it's overwhelming. Are we in a crisis? Certainly, because we don't really know what to do with, there's a sense of the indeterminate future of the cultural effects of the new technologies of communication.
So I'll move on to another topic that emerges out of this conversation. When we were putting together and thinking about the organization of the Memory Studies Association, we were very consciously trying to invent a tradition. We have a logo that's made out of little Post-it notes, which is supposed to remind you of memory. We refer to it as the second annual conference. We have T-shirts, and we all still have our we'll have T-shirts from now on. We kept our tote bags from last year. Memory and the sense of a shared past is a way of underwriting identity and underwriting a future. Yet it seems that in the actual work we do, we've become traumatologists. That is, we're focusing almost exclusively on the dark side, necrology, victimology, trauma, atrocity, and I actually taught a course 1 year called Trauma, Atrocity, and Suffering. And I got a lot of ribbing from my colleagues that, oh, should we be worried about you? And I said, absolutely. How has is this an accurate depiction of the field that we've lost the constitutive functions or possibilities of remembering together and constructing a world out of our sense of continuity and time? Are we focusing too much on the dark side?
Yes.
And what do we do about it?
Just one word. I do think we're focusing too much on it. That's what I meant about the palimpsest of the 20th century. And I think that, mind you, that's my work too. I mean, My husband always says, why is it the first thing you ever do when you go on a trip is go to a Holocaust museum? Can't you think of something happier to do? So I mean, I'm part of that, but it seems to me that one of our jobs is to understand why it is that everybody wants to be a victim today. We have a need to historicize and analyze that. I just came back from China, and China, as you know, is on the rise, and you feel it everywhere. And you say to young people, you say, how is it that with everything around you, that you are focusing on a century of humiliation? Why is that the only thing with your so-called 5,000 years of history, you're not settling on something a little more glorifying? The point is that the current coin of national, particularly nationalist memory, is victims, suffering, etc., injustice. And we have two jobs. One, find out why that is. Number two, memory is, as Jeff says, memory is not only about bad pasts. It is constitutive. I can't say that. Constitutive.
Close enough.
Close enough. All right. And I think memory as a positive, and I don't mean memory as a positive construction only of identity, because identity is itself dangerous, but what do we do, what can we do with our memories in a constructive direction for the future? How to use the past constructively, how to pick parts of the past, as long as we're picking. We don't have to always pick the Holocaust, I guess, or genocide or whatever. So I think that that's another thing that we can do. And just speaking personally and out of turn, I am, how to put this politely? All right.
I think that the focus of the traumatic is directly linked to the question of whether memory studies or not has to do with the palimpsest of the 20th century. I would say no. Memory studies is not even about the 20th century. I know that many people who are sitting here have come to memory studies because they were interested in the Second World War, in the Vietnam War, in 9/11, in the Holocaust, because this is our recent history, or you were interested in injustices that are recent and in the wounds that people still carry who are alive, who have this as lived experience. But that's, for me, one part of memory studies. And again, coming from a German tradition, our important books of the early 1990s were about memory in ancient Egyptian cultures. This is how I was socialized to the field. So for me, the natural view of memory studies is, of course, you can work on the 20th century, and of course there is this tendency towards focusing on the traumatic, but of course you can also work on medieval memoria. You can work on memory and the ancients, and what I would really call for is a new mnemohistory. We've had mnemohistory, there are wonderful historical studies about memory in the Renaissance, memory in the Middle Ages, memory in different antiquities, but we have not gone back to mnemohistory after the diverse turns that we've had in memory studies. So through the transnational, transcultural, multidirectional lenses, through planetary, new materialists, whatever lenses, can I now go back? And I'm trying to do that because I have a book project on the Odyssey, on Homer, and that really gives me the chance to look at memory processes over a period of 3,000 years. And this is what I want to do. I think we've developed in the past decade a wonderful toolbox, and I think we should find out what of this toolbox helps us to address histories that are, or mnemohistories that are a little bit older than our present time.
You addressed this in your book on cultural memory, including period. I think one of the most, most positive, most forward-looking strand of memory studies has been the whole issue of, what started out as orality literacy. So the early work was on that passage from primary orality to manuscript literacy, and then so much work on the democratization of print culture. And I have been quite fascinated by the work that you and some of your colleagues have been doing on digital age memory, with its strong sense of dynamism, of incessant change and of innovation, understanding memory in that way. And I wonder if this does have some ties. Is this a kind of secondarity? That was an argument of Walter Ahn when he wrote his book on morality and history. He didn't develop it, but he anticipated with the coming of electronic communication that we would enter an age of a second orality. And it's kind of gnomic what that meant. But I had some sense of it in terms of your conception that you've been developing with digital age memory. Because you could say with something of the sort that Pierre Nora did, you were looking for foundational things. You were looking for stability. You were looking for places of memory on which we could we could maintain our sense of identity in the face of the disintegration of the grand narrative. So it was the stress on memory as preservation, as opposed to the sense of memory as inspiration or innovation.
There are so many things on the table now that I don't know where to go first, but I am obviously one culprit of bringing memory to trauma and stuff, but there is a flip side to this also, because it's not just about victimhood, which, I mean, I'm also very interested in the politics of victimhood, of course, as Carol was saying, but some of these memories of violent events are also refurbished through resistance, notions of resistance and heroism. I mean, in different ways, but it's not about trauma. The whole thing. No, they were not victims. They never were victims. They are honorable, fighters, but not. But I want to go back to the notion of expanding the tradition of memory studies that I know you're very interested in, and Astrid already hinted at. Looking back to the past. But you are looking, I mean, I'm speaking now as an anthropologist. No? When we had this thing about interdisciplinarity, I work in an interdisciplinary team in Spain. I have forensic doctors, literary critics in the same room. Nightmare. I mean, but I try. But it's, but the thing is that I also think I started to look back in the history of anthropology, and I realized it's about memory, the whole thing. And we study rituals, we study medical anthropology. It's about getting sick in a certain society, and then you have to connect to the ancestors, and then the shamans come in, and then so the whole thing was about, hey, we've been doing memory, but without calling it memory. But one thing that really interested me, and I think that we, in terms of stretching, the range of memory studies, is one brand of anthropology which is called ethnohistory, which is extremely interesting because it's not about the history of non-Western groups, but about indigenous ontologies of the past, which means that obviously we are, most of us, all the time thinking in Western terms about millennial time, progressive, whatnot. But many other groups in the world, they have concepts, they have another totally different notions of time. And I think that memory studies, if it wants to broaden up, we have to incorporate these, not only by bringing in Western scholars studying these groups, but also from bringing people from the groups to talk to us, and trying to, so we can understand that there are other ways, totally different ways of relating to the past, or conceiving the passage of time. And I think this is very interesting. And in this experimental moment that I talked about before, there were some experiments related to this, and they were extremely interesting. Because, for example, in some regions of Central America, the time is circular. What happened already will happen again. And that's a totally different way of understanding the present and understanding what's going on. And I think we have to go in that direction, try to incorporate all these traditions within our field. It's a challenge, but I think it's worthwhile.
So the next question on my plan is actually Andrew Hoskin's question about how we address the issue of memory in the brain versus may not be the right word, memory in the wild. But instead of doing that, I'd like to make sure we have time for questions and comments from you all. So I will come around with a microphone if you would like to participate in the conversation. The floor is open. We'll go to about 11:15 because we started so late.
Thank you very much. My name is Karen Rattler, and I would like to suggest that we all say our names. Since this is such a huge group, it would be great to know who we are. Thank you very much. You already alluded, all of you, to the digital age, and you didn't use the term digital divide. But I'm wondering, in your own work, how have you changed the way that you approach sort of material culture through the virtual? And in what way has that brought you to actually seeing, I guess, diverse modes of memory that are across the globe, not just local? Because I'm thinking that there is a digital divide. On the other hand, there are ways of using the virtual in non-Western, non-global North communities that are much more sophisticated than I think what we're used to or some of us in the West. I'm just wondering how you have shifted your work using digital technologies and how you work the virtual into the work that you do.
Yeah. Can I pass them?
I think that's a totally crucial question. When we started working on these mass grave diggings, we were taking slides. And 5 years later, everybody had a smartphone, and it totally transformed the field. And we have worked a little bit on, and we were working on the digital aspects of these memorial processes. And Andrew Hoskins is our guru in a sense. I mean, he's so sophisticated, so I don't know what to say having him here. But what has happened is that one interesting process is that the transformation from the family album into the digital kind of different types of digital artifacts. For example, we're analyzing how people in some funerary arrangements, they have like PowerPoints. And they have taken pictures with their smartphones of the old pictures, and then they integrate them into pictures they have taken of the very exhumations and all the rituals, and then they put some pop music. And then, okay, that's a wonderful memory product to analyze, so to speak. No? But I think there are a lot of problems with the digitalizing, a lot of problems. One of them is the excess, the saturation, the way in which the decontextualization. Anybody can go. In Spain, there is no judicial umbrella in the exhumation, so anybody can go to an exhumation with a smartphone, take a picture, and in real time, this is going to be Twitter, Facebook, Google. I mean, name it. So it's really complicated. So these bodies that are coming out, and there is a focus on the body. I mean, this forensic term is real. I mean, people is really into bones, which is something that shocks me. I don't use bones in my PowerPoints. I use as less as possible, but people is focusing on that. Then this is the memory that goes up, and then as soon as it's uploaded, it's a totally loss of control over these images. And then they start to mix up with bodies from other massacres or disasters around the world, and you don't know if they are real or not real. And some of the images we have of shootings, actual shootings of civilians in the Spanish Civil War, they come from movies, but they start to move around, and suddenly they become real, and people comment on it. And so I think this is a huge topic, and we, as memory scholars, we have absolutely transform the ways in which we work, and we have to be very attentive to all the aspects. And there are many layers of complexity in this new digitalization of memory relations, so to speak. But I'll let my colleagues also.
Just to refer to Andrew Hoskins' new book, Digital Memory Studies, and I think, again, he gave it a name that's for me a really important subfield of memory studies, and I think, which is not just one thing, but has branched out into different concerns. The one has to do with the digitization of material or photographic material or analogic media that would be remediated.